In this lecture, we are going to learn how to create these UML use case diagrams. And these are very important, especially with your requirements documentation, because it's a way that you can take your textual requirements and you can create a visual representation of them. And that really helps the client kind of see what the system is supposed to do and what different users or actors, which I'll explain in a little bit, can interact with the system. So let's just say that our system we are creating is a simple point of sale system. And let's just say that our system, let's go ahead and draw that in blue actually. Our system, let's draw that a little more straight. So our system is right here, and this is the boundaries of our current system. Well, first we need to draw the users that are going to interact with our point of sale system. And our users are just called actors. Again, actors are just anyone that interacts with our point of sale system. So we'll draw 2 people on both sides because we'll have 4 different actors. But don't let this confuse you to think that actors are limited people. If you were building a software for a dog or another animal, they would essentially become an actor as well. An actor is anyone, not limited to a person, but any object that interacts with the system as a whole. In fact, if 2 systems were interacting with one another, a system itself could be an actor for a different system. So just for clarification, let's go ahead and label these. So for our point of sale system, we're going to have our cashier. We're going to have our system admin. And then we're also going to have on this side our customer. And we are going to have our store manager. Now within our system, we're going to have our use cases. And our use cases are pretty much those functional requirements. It's what our system is going to accomplish. So let's actually change out of this blue color into a nice green. And we're going to use this, we're actually going to use red to, actually let's write out our use cases in green first. So our first one, we're doing a point of sale system. So naturally you wanted to buy an item. That's our first action, buy items. And then we also want, of course, some way to log in. And then we want, what if something happens to the item? We want a way to refund money back to the customer. And then we also need someone to start up the store, start up the system, maybe start up the store for that day. And then we need one more to manage users. Now, of course, you can have more functions in a point of sale system than just these. These are just the basic ones that I thought of off the top of my head. So we're going to section off these so they know they are separate requirements, they're separate functionalities. So we're going to switch back to green. So now when we have our actors, we have our use cases, and we have our system boundary, we need to draw a way to connect these actors with each use case, with each action. And this will illustrate which actor can do what task within the system. Well, the cashier should be able to check out items. They should be able to log into the system so they can, verify that it's a cashier. And then they should also be able to refund or begin the refund functionality for the customer. Now, a customer should also be able to buy items within the system, because if a customer can't buy the items, obviously, you're not selling anything. And they should also be able to request a refund. So if anything happens with the items, they can then get a refund from the store. It's just good salesmanship, I suppose. And then our system administrator is the one that needs to be able to manage the users. So they'll manage the cashiers and the managers, and I assume perhaps the customers, but I don't know why they would need to do that. But if that's the goal of this point of sale system, it definitely could. Then manager, the store managers need to be able to start the store. So what does this use case diagram tell us? Well, it tells us that our point of sale system is comprised of these functions, and then, or use cases you could call them, as it is a use case diagram. And then each of these different actors acts upon this system to do a certain task. Cashiers will, buy items, or they'll more appropriately sell items. They'll be able to log in for verification, and then they'll be able to refund the customer's transactions. The store manager will be able to initially start up the store. The system administrator will be able to manage the users who are stored within the store for the login, I guess the store system. Now for a more complex than this point of sale system, this is definitely still appropriate, and it's a good way to visualize for people who might not be as technical as developers on what the system will do and how different user classes will be able to interact and work within this system. Now let's take this buy items use case. Now, so we have this initial buy items use case. Well, we can take one of those use cases, and let's just say that this use case was buy items. And we can actually create a use case description that describes what that particularly is within the system, because yet again, we don't want any ambiguity with our requirements and our use cases, because as I mentioned many times, ambiguity is very bad in software engineering and requirement analysis. So we have our use case name, which is just buy items. So should have labeled that. Actually, we'll do that in red. So for our use case descriptions, we want our name, which I'll abbreviate as N. You want the actors, which I'll abbreviate as A. And you also want just a description on what will go on, how they buy items. We'll just label that as D. So our actors is going to be, as we can see in as we saw in our use case diagram, the actors are the cashier and the customer. So we're just going to write down customer. Then we're going to comma separate and do cashier. And then we'll do our description. So we'll just say customer arrives at checkout. Then we will say cashier checks out customer. Then we'll just finish this use case with customer completes transaction. I mean, you might want to go a little bit more in depth in this for description, but for practical purposes, this is fine. So we have our name of our use case, and actually we'll just go ahead and label this as the use case description. And again, our use cases are just our functional requirements. So we have our use case and it's buy items. And then we have our actors, which is the customer and the cashier, which we saw in our diagram. And then we have our description, which is the customer arrives at checkout. Let's go ahead, put that in there. Customer arrives at checkout. Then the cashier checks out customer. Out the customer, that might be more grammatically appropriate. Then the customer completes transactions. The transaction, we're just going to proofread my own writing here. So the customer arrives at checkout, the cashier checks out the customer, then the customer completes the transaction. And that's pretty much the end of our use case, and that's just a very brief, a very good description of our use case. Now you can go more in depth with use case descriptions and literally walk it through how the actors react to the system and what the system does in reaction to the action of the actors. So that's something we might touch up in a later video, but for right now this is more than necessary to begin your use case descriptions.